Hello, I'm Diana Farca and I invite you to walk in tandem. Today's guests are Joshua and Tziporah Goldberg. They are counselors and cognitive behavioral therapy practitioners. I have discovered them through YouTube after doing my own research on the topic. And Tziporah is very brave because she started counseling for her BPD condition. And I think she has many more insight to tell us today.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
How do you differentiate between love bombing versus genuine interest in the other person at the beginning of a relationship?
Okay. Well, with most BPD relationships, there is that quick attachment. So this is with friendships or partners as well. So it is hard to tell. It's hard to tell the difference of infatuation or genuine interest, I guess. And with the love bombing, so with my current with my husband, we're Jewish, so really the relationship is until you get married, you don't get too close to one another. So with that, my love bombing, I guess, like if I was doing it, was I wanted to call him a lot, to see him a lot, go to coffee, and I would make him lots of food and just try to be with him. So I guess that could be a type of love bombing. And the interest was definitely genuine. At the same time, it was probably emphasized because of the BPD attachment, the quick attachment. So the interest was there. I was Canadian, he was Australian, so we got along quite well. When we were dating, we had similar interests. He liked Lord of the Rings. I really liked Lord of the Rings, so that worked. And we understood each other for the most part. So yeah, to tell the difference between love bombing, I would say if I was feeling quite you know, I don't want to say manic, because borderlines don't really have mania per se, but the euphoria that comes from it, I think, could be something to tell the difference of calm, relaxed interest versus like a euphoric, manic attachment, if that makes sense.
Somehow.
Pardon?
Idealization somehow.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's about it with the difference of love bombing versus the genuine interest.
What is the role of fear in breakdowns in BPD? Because I also heard it on your channel, the term of splitting, and basically the me versus you mentality. Maybe you can explain.
Okay. Yeah, so with splitting, it's very much black and white thinking. So things can be going well, and then if something happens that creates the split, which could be a perceived slight, like a perceived criticism or something that just kind of triggers a person or hits the wrong button, I guess, it can create that black and white thinking where there's no way to see the good anymore. So it's like it feels like everything's gone wrong and bad, and now the relationship is very scary and could be ruined, whereas the other person might not think that it's that big of a deal, I guess. So with my relationship with my husband, there's been lots of splitting. In the beginning, there was a lot more when before we kind of understood each other so well. And the me versus you did come into it, where I felt very insecure. I felt uncertain of motives sometimes. Like BPD splitting really affects the way we see someone's intention behind things, and that can really make the splitting come out. So now with what happens internally is that I can recognize when things are trying to separate like that, and I'll notice the thoughts or kind of like internal words that are being used that kind of say, that indicate that this person's going into the bad category in my mind, you know?
Do you also have like body cues? Let's say pain, stomach, breathing faster or something, or no?
What, during a split?
Yeah, before the split, right before the split.
Yeah, I guess you could say that you would probably notice the warm kind of face, like how whenever anger comes, it kind of goes up. Yeah. So you'd probably feel, I would feel the kind of like heat, or very agitated, very much agitated. Wouldn't want to be in the conversation. So the longer the conversation goes, the more agitated I would feel. And the heart does race. That's something to work on in regards to like breathing through things, because someone with anger or anxiety breathes quite shallow, so you don't get relaxing breath. So the more you're triggered, the more your adrenaline's going, the less you're breathing, and then you can't really calm yourself down so much. So physiologically, my breathing and probably the heat in my face would be an indicator.
What you lived through your childhood also plays a part in BPD. Did you have some emotional patterns that cause it? For instance, an unavailable parent or something like that? That caused the emergence of BPD?
Yes. So I'm sure there's genetic factors for myself. My father's diagnosed bipolar. My mother is not diagnosed, but she's very much emotionally unavailable, as much as she tries now. But as a child, it was very difficult to have any emotional validation. My parents split up when I was young, so they got divorced when I was very young, and my mother didn't emotionally handle that well. So it was a lot of emotional neglect, and physically too. She was dealing with her own problems at the time. So the model I had for emotion regulation or how to cope in life was very unhealthy. Unhealthy coping mechanisms, drugs, alcohol, hiding your emotions, and so on. So yeah. In regards to my family, like my grandparents, they don't show so much affection, but they're still together. You can tell they love each other. So I think something just happened with my parents that really was devastating to the emotional trauma chain, and now I'm the one trying to break it. So yeah.
My next question is going to be for both. I'm not victim shaming here, but I found an interesting quote about control, and I'm going to say the name. The book was The Abandonment Wound by Jean-Charles Bouchot, and it says something like this: if we look closer, we or she, I'm going to say he who obeys has the power, and yet he only has the power that his abuser gives him. He provides. At any moment, he or she might say no, but then he or she would lose the influence over his or her executioner. So nothing seems more practical than to consider yourself a victim. And as I was saying, I'm not talking about shaming, but I've noticed from my own experience that I'm codependent. I have CPTSD. Okay. And I used to have this thing with control. I also had it in my abusive relationship. And I see it also for people with BPD, with codependence, with NPDs. Could you explain like what role does control play into your relationships?
Okay. So as a borderline, there's always going to be that desire to have omnipotent control, like control of what's going on. I do think we learn this as a child, because sometimes when you're dealing with a parent who's when you're uncertain of how the parent's going to respond to something, how they're going to react, or punishments or whatever you might experience, I think you learn to try to manipulate a situation, to put it very clearly, to try not to be in trouble, to hide your mistakes if you've made them, to try to use the right wording. So that is a level of control, I would say. So I think we do learn that as a child. I too have CPTSD. It's both BPD and CPTSD. So definite a codependent thing as well. And I think we do learn how to try to control situations, even the language that's used of trying to kind of talk for a person or get a certain result from a conversation, and not really, like, we don't have the ability, unless there's lots of practice, to comfortably receive feedback and ask for things, or like put yourself out there. So there's lots of trying to make things happen, and that can be tricky in relationships. I've noticed that you're laughing. Do you get what I'm saying?
Because I have it, and I'm owning it, but this is why I laugh, because it's so like,
so it makes sense, right? Because it's like it's a safety thing. So control, fear makes you want to control something, because then I'm not so scared of it, so I think we learn that as a child. And in relationships, even friendships, sometimes it's like you want to make sure you're using the right words and you're not messing up or getting that abandonment trigger. So I do think that in my current marriage, since that's kind of what we're talking about too, is that there's been lots of change in how I try to communicate, expressing what I want and need in a way that I don't have to try to make it happen, and to be comfortable with conversations about things happening, getting things, doing things, without feeling like I need to make it happen because I'm a bad girl otherwise, basically, because like that's the message you have as a child or in previous abusive relationships. So
it's the first relationship in which you convey your needs without trying to say them indirectly, or
is this the first one?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
I think so. This is the one where I've grown most in my communication skills. I've had friendships before that were, best friends that were a lot more comfortable. There was no issue of trying to manipulate things. But in regards to like a partner, I would say with this husband, there's been a lot of communication skills built and trial and error, lots of error, but get working through it and getting to a place where I can comfortably try to speak.
What would you consider the most important need in an intimate relationship?
Okay, so I guess it kind of ties to what we were just talking about. I would say safety in expressing, safety in having emotions, safety in being yourself, because sometimes, and with a borderline or a codependent, there's that insecurity. So you almost kind of make sure that you're going to be likable, or that you can put yourself to the side to make sure that you're emulating the thing that you think they want to see, or that that you get good feedback for. So I think safety in being yourself and knowing that you don't have to be that person because they're that person and you're you, basically. So overall, safety in emotional expression, because again, in childhood, that's the main thing that kind of ends up creating the downfall and turning into a borderline, is that emotional unsafety, I would say.
I sometimes find myself listening to people, but because of the codependence and trying to please other people, my first impulse, we probably have different instincts, is to offer solutions. But sometimes I do it without the other person asking for solution. Maybe the other person just wants to be listened. So I have to work with this a lot. And the second is that I often find myself interrupting to show that I'm listening. But why? It was a reason to be punished when I was a little. I never zoom out, like dissociate and you talk to me and I don't listen to you. I always listen, and I have like a memory that tells you after 2 years what you told me about something that maybe it's not of importance for me, but it is for you.
Yeah.
So I actively register it with mind and heart, but I keep interrupting because I nod, or I say yes, or I say I'm listening. So my question would be this: what would be the key advices which you would give someone who's BPD, codependent, or NPD regarding listening in relationships?
Wow, I really understand what you're saying there with the listening and then almost in the interrupting, and then it seems like maybe you're not listening properly. I totally understand that. And even the solutions, I really can relate to what you're saying there. And I think with the solutions, it's like there's that built in trying to make sure things are safe and good and well for everybody. So the solutions kind of come automatically to create almost that safety, I would say. And in regards to the interrupting, it is something that I still to this day struggle with, that I just want to jump in there, and other people might not receive it as attentive listening. It's kind of disruptive, and I really relate to what you're saying there. And I think with the advice for listening is practicing. Well, I remember even having to learn to practice to kind of like tap my leg or like try so hard to wait to respond. So I'd try to divert the energy elsewhere so that I didn't interrupt and ruin the flow of the conversation. So I would say just really mindfully trying to say that I will have my turn, or maybe they do want to be heard. Like try to kind of like tell yourself these things, that maybe they do just want to be listened to. Maybe they don't need a solution, or you can ask them an open question. So with listening, they speak and then you say, well, what do you think would be best to do? Instead of offering that solution, you ask that question to go back and forth. It's hard to learn that conversation style if you've had unhealthy relationships or unhealthy conversation modeling. And so, and I just want to also go back to also remembering these details about people. Everything you said, I can relate to exactly. So I think it's quite understandable with most codependents, which are, borderlines and NPDs, that's how it goes. You register everything. And yeah, so that could be helpful in a relationship if you can communicate well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What is your favorite person in NPD? And I also wanted to ask, how does it relate to the narcissistic supply in NPD? But I'm making the question because I read the book. It's called The Narcissistic Borderline Couple by Joan Lacar, and it talks about BPD and NPD relationship. And I was wondering about the relationship, because what happens, for instance, if your favorite person becomes a narcissist, let's say, or how do you manifest with the favorite person? A normal one and a toxic one?
In BPD, I think most people do experience the favorite person. Mine haven't been so severe as what I have seen people with such a severe favorite person attachment that they become even suicidal with the loss of them, or the person kind of abandoning them, or whatever it might be. So sometimes it gets very severe. And I guess that would be something to be wary of with those type of people, for the narcissist coming in and being that FP, because a narcissist is already naturally boundary intruding and abusive tendencies and so on. So I know that for some people it gets very severe. For myself, I've had FPs, favorite people, and I've also had them and dropped them really easily. So mine haven't been as severe as others, but I would say that in regards to an FP for a borderline, it's a relationship that's very unbalanced. Like for the borderline, it's so intense. The communication, the feedback, the tone of voice can make or break the borderline's day. Whereas in a normal friendship, there could be conflict, there could be misunderstandings, and it's not devastating for a regular person. So the FP is a very imbalanced relationship. It can be friendships, it can be family, it can be partners, and it can be a decent relationship. It's just that the borderline's way more invested or intense about it. Now, in regards to narcissistic supply, I would say this is a dangerous area, because the narcissist basically scans for people who look to attach or look to please or have dissolved boundaries. And a borderline has dissolved boundaries. We struggle with where our emotions are and the other person's begins, our needs and wants, all this stuff. So I would say that a borderline is going to be a narcissist, a good supply for a narcissist. If they had an a favorite person, it would be a borderline person, because the borderline so much just the boundaries just go inwards, and the narcissist goes into those boundaries, essentially, if that visual kind of makes sense. So I don't know if narcissists have a favorite person, a FP, but a borderline and a narcissist often will find themselves together.
Oh no, they don't have it, but they have the narcissistic supply. So a BPD make perfect sense as a narcissistic supply. And
yes,
be a match made in hell somehow.
It is, yeah, for sure. And without having boundaries, it's very easy to become a narcissist supply, being a codependent or CPTSD or BPD. So I would definitely say that it is a very dangerous combo. And you'll often see that combination because of the dynamic. And they're both, as you had Sam Backman on before, and he explains it so well, that basically a narcissist and a borderline have the same kind of like base. So they're very similar, but then the coping, it separates at some point. So I definitely think that it's a dangerous combination. And I've never had a narcissist favorite person, but I've suffered narcissistic abuse as a borderline. So that's kind of my answer for that. But the borderline has to watch out for that narcissist and be careful.
Taking it slow might seem a good idea. Since you were diagnosed, what have been the improvements and your current limitations? But also another question, which is like intertwined. There is Mastin Kip, he's amazing. And he is a psychologist that talks about the fact that he sees personality disorders as being curable, because some psychologists say they are not. And some admit that they are actually relationship coping mechanisms, and they are treatable. What's your take on it? This is why I'm asking about the improvements since you started therapy, and if you have current limitations.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely seen improvements, and I still have limitations. I would say personality disorders can definitely, I call it recovery. I call it kind of recovery as in sometimes you can relapse, so to speak. Like if something, if a new trauma response maybe comes up that you weren't really aware of and it hasn't been resolved yet, then that could be something that could lean into a split or create an issue, an interpersonal issue with someone. So I do think that personality disorders can be managed, recovered, or healed. Do they go away 100%? I'm not sure, because I think that there's a whole factor of how we were shaped, and it is hard to rewire your entire system. At the same time, you can definitely resolve emotional trauma, do lots of inner child work, which is what we do as well, me and my husband, and to learn new ways of how to be. And you just have to practice and implement and kind of retrain yourself, because it becomes so ingrained to behave the way you do. So my improvements have definitely been with communication, as we were talking about, and not being so codependent in regards to being affected by someone else's emotions. Like I can, my emotional boundaries are stronger now, where I can let someone be upset and not feel like it's my fault or I'm in trouble kind of thing. And I can remain more calm in situations. So my emotional intensity has definitely become more balanced, and being able to develop healthy relationships has definitely improved. Having friendships where I'm not anxious all the time is definitely something that I've achieved now, and stable work and having a child. So these are all indications of improvement, and I do feel that it is improvement. So there are times when in regards to limitations, there are times when something might come up where, okay, so maybe I do need to still do some inner child work on that, or create a firmer boundary here or there in regards to emotional responses. And so there's definitely limitations. And I think that's when you have CPTSD, as you might understand, is that there's layers and there's so many things. So they pop up sometimes and you might not know that they're there.
From my take as a codependent, it's not linear, the recovery process. Like, as you said, like it's not linear, and yes, sometimes things pop up. Yeah. And the second thing, even if I would have years without going to, I don't know, let's say hopefully to therapy, I would still continue doing breathing exercises, praying, meditation, inner child work, as you said, because I think this is like a long life commitment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like maintenance. You have to kind of maintain it. Otherwise, you might fall back into old habits. And that is why, like you said, it's not linear, or you can have slip ups. And that's why it's good to remind yourself that if something happens, or if an emotion takes over, or something doesn't go along the calm, healed version, then don't beat yourself up, because it doesn't remove all of your work. It doesn't throw all the work in the trash. It means that, okay, here's one more thing, and breathe, work through it, figure out where this button's coming from, and try to resolve it.
My final question is about a concept which some call parallel parenting. And I said earlier, I was talking about toxic people, but actually people are not toxic. Relationships are, toxic. And parallel parenting refers to parents who are in a relationship with an abusive partner, get divorced, and then have to raise the children. Do you have any thoughts on parallel parenting, or the legacy of the children that have a parent that is BPD or MPD or on the spectrum?
I think that it is next to impossible to raise a child with a narcissist, with an MPD. It's very difficult with someone with BPD who hasn't done lots of self-work or realized the importance of the child, because with BPD and splitting and the emotional intensity, it really causes the BPD person to be, I don't want to say selfish, because there's no intention to be selfish, but it creates this kind of, the emotions are the most important thing. So everything else goes away, including the child's, what's going to be happening to the child. So if a child sees a parent split, or sees how intense something can get, like fighting, the talking negatively about the other parent and so on, like the child sees this, and if you're not aware of the damage it could do to a child, that's why it becomes generational trauma. And that's why often an MPD or a BPD parent will create a BPD child, basically, because it's the BPD becomes more important, unfortunately, not literally, but because of the emotions. So I would say it's difficult to raise a child with a BPD spouse or ex because of that. And the BPD person really has to keep in mind the child and how it's going to impact them, and that a child needs stable parents. And sometimes it's better to have two separate stable parents than two together where the BPD person is constantly getting triggered, or where it's a toxic relationship, as you said. So you need to think about the child. And in regards to an MPD, I think it's really hard, because unfortunately the child becomes almost like a pawn for the MPD person. And it's really sad to think that way, but it is how it goes. So it's almost impossible. But again, having two parents, and if one's stable and trying to raise the child with an MPD person, at least the child's seen one healthy, stable parent. So overall, whoever's raising a child just needs to think of the child and how that's going to affect them. So having one healthy parent and one unhealthy parent is going to be better than a toxic relationship in the same house where the child's seeing toxicity all the time.
So it's an excuse when people say they fight for the good of the children. I'm joking.
Well, it's you gotta choose your battles. You have to understand that the child thinks that they're like, a child sees both parents and says, I'm 50% mom and I'm 50% dad. And mom's being really mean to dad, or dad's being really mean to mom. Like, what does that mean about me? What does that make me? So that's always something that's impacted me, is to remember that the child sees themselves in the parents. So whatever you say or do towards that other one, the child feels it against himself because they're impacted by it. So
thank you very much for coming on the show.
yeah, thanks for having me.
So Joshua, what were the first signs of unresolved emotional trauma in Tziporah's part at the beginning of your relationship?
Yeah, so the first things that I noticed, and I have to say that a person has to be able to notice these. I was able to notice these because I'd done a significant amount of counseling and therapy work in the past, like on myself, and also some inner child healing in the past. So I was able to notice these. A lot of people are not able to notice these because at the start, before the person reassociates with their attachment trauma, it can be quite subtle and invisible, which can be hard to spot it if you're used to a dysfunctional and like an emotionally neglectful environment. If that's what you grew up in and you haven't healed from that, a lot of the times you can't even notice it. But the first two things that I noticed was like emotional defensive-ness. Okay, so being defensive towards the whole topic of emotions, like her own emotions and also my emotions. There's a whole, I guess, defensiveness around emotions, or like emotional avoidance, and just like a subtle defensiveness altogether is the two things that I spotted. So emotional avoidance and subtle defensiveness were the first two things that I noticed, and they didn't really fit. Like it didn't really make much sense why this was happening, and they were the first two things that I noticed.
Did you have the emotional patterns modeled in your family of origin, or did you have like a parent or a relative that was BPD or NPD or with a sort of personality disorder?
My father would probably, he is on medication for some form of attachment trauma and, personality disorder, mental health issue. Maybe he would fit into the BPD category for a male, but I don't know if he's actually been diagnosed or not, because in the previous generation, as we know, like there wasn't really the whole system wasn't as efficient as it is today. But he would probably fit into that. But I didn't see anything like this in my childhood. The way that my parents, relationship dysfunction manifested, it was always out of sight of myself and my brothers. So we never saw any dysfunction like in our family, like emotions. Well, I'm from a very emotional family, basically like a Mediterranean, like Middle Eastern style of family where there's a lot of emotions, a lot of passion. And so, to start a relationship with someone, and in the first few days, there's like avoidance of emotions. For me, it was very, very strange. It didn't make any sense. And I noticed it. And I know with a lot of the people that I work with, they don't notice these because if there's a kind of similarity or like some form of familiarity with the childhood, they just think that it's normal. But I straight away noticed that it wasn't normal. And my childhood was very, loving and full of emotions. But my father's and my mother's issues in the relationship always manifested when we weren't around. We never saw it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What would be your most important need in a relationship?
The most important thing in a relationship?
Yeah.
I would say the most important thing in a relationship, in any relationship, it doesn't matter if it's like a spousal relationship or whether it's even like a professional relationship or even friends. I think the most important thing in a relationship is understanding, like to actually understand the other person is the most important thing. And also for yourself to feel understood. I think is the most important thing. Because I mean, think about it. You can disagree with someone on anything, or they can be upset with you. They can be emotional. It doesn't matter what's going on. If each person feels like the other person deeply understands them, that brings a connection and a sense of peace to the relationship. And, you know, I think, you know, not understanding each other is an actual, like, it's a suffering to not feel understood. And so I would say the most important thing is understanding. I would say like to understand their feelings and their view, their thoughts, their opinion. I think that's the most important thing. I think if there's understanding, everything else will work itself out. Now, obviously with personality disorders, I mean, you know, they're not really available to understand the other person. That's why they're so dysfunctional and they become so painful, is because the person's not really in the relationship or available to understand the other person. And over time, that becomes very painful and destructive.
Which brings me to my next question. What advice would you give about listening, especially for NPDs, BPDs, for people with a personality?
About listening, yeah. So I mean, first of all, it's very difficult for, you know, the codependent, you know, even the borderline person and the narcissist for sure. I mean, they are not listening really. I mean, they're hearing what you're saying, but when you talk to a narcissist, they're actually, I guess, recoding what you're saying, and they're attributing their own meaning to it. So you never feel understood with a narcissist, because they use what you say and they interpret it according to their own narrative. So with a narcissist, you never feel really heard or understood, because they're not actually understanding you. They're listening, but they're not hearing. They're taking what you're saying and they're making their own meaning of it. They're not trying to get to what you mean. So with a narcissist, it's a hopeless case. But with like a codependent person or even a borderline person, you know, they also have a lot of difficulties in listening. And you know, I think deep down it comes to the feeling of safety and security with their inner child, and obviously feeling like that they're present and that they have space and that they will get an opportunity to talk, and that they can understand the other person safely. And if they have, I guess, a problem or unpleasant feelings, you know, the BPD and codependent person, you know, they have to get their inner child to a point where the inner child feels safe to be in that conversation and feels calm. And that takes a significant amount of work, but it can be done. And I don't think, I haven't seen it happen with a narcissist yet, but the codependent and the borderline can certainly reparent their inner child and to become, I guess, secure in themselves and feel safe and comfortable in conversations, so that they're able to calmly listen and to not have this urgency to feel heard or to get their point across. Because obviously with listening, it's very important to be able to be calm and to really to try and listen, you know. But if you have an urgency, it takes away from the ability to listen and to understand the other person.
Is it valid or okay? This is something that I do. I think I heard it also on your channel. If I feel the need to interrupt to tell the other person if he's in, let's say, severe pain or incredible emotion, or I'm here, I understand you. I also had the bad habit of giving solutions. Is it okay if we say at the beginning of a discussion, so what do you want from me? Do you want me just to listen? Do you want an advice? Or like frame the questions in an open way? Tziporah also mentioned it. Not give the solution to the other person. So is it okay if for people who actually don't have the basis of listening, we ask the question when we go into a discussion, would you like me to listen? Would you like me to give advice, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So my philosophy is, you know, should always be about the feelings first. Always feelings first. The person, what they're feeling, and then obviously one person at a time. So what they're feeling first, and then what you're feeling first, and then solutions and everything comes after that. So I'll give you an example, right? Say, for example, your partner comes home from work and they start talking to you about, like, you know, the stressful day and, like, yeah, and this guy at work, he said this, he said that, and he's a real pain and not everything else. So obviously there's solutions there, but the philosophy is feelings first. So it's about asking the person, so what did you feel what emotions did you feel in what you went through today? Like, what are you feeling from it? So trying to get them to express their feelings, because that's really what's driving the conversation. So, and then obviously once each person has expressed their feelings and the other person has given the empathy and understood what the other person is feeling and validated their feelings, then there can be solutions, other discussions, plans, reassurance and things like this. But my philosophy is feelings first. And it also helps a lot with conflict resolution to get to the feelings first. So that's, I would say solutions are fine, but I would say feelings have to be addressed first. And I think everyone on this earth just wants people to understand what they're feeling, and that helps them to feel like that they're not carrying that emotion by themselves in the world, because that's a very lonely feeling.
Yeah, it's like, I see you, I understand you, your emotions are valid.
Exactly. And then once that happens, you can provide solutions, so like there's this is a very common thing. I mean, men struggle with this a lot also, I have to say, because men are very intellectual. We like to think and we come up with solutions and we're problem solvers. And so when a woman tells a man their feelings, or they're telling them a story, for example, she comes home from coffee, she has coffee with a friend, okay, and she says to her partner, I caught up with this friend again today for coffee, and she never listens to me when I talk. She always puts her own story in. She never listens to me. So the guy's like, okay, so like, why do you keep catching up with her? Why don't you just catch up with a different friend that listens to you, right? It's a simple solution, problem solved, easy. And then she says, no, you're not listening to me. And he's like, well, yes, I am. I heard what you said, and that's the way to fix it. And she's like, no, you're not hearing what I'm saying. And it goes back and forward, because he's not addressing what she's feeling, and that's really what she wants. That's why she's telling him this story. So the correct way for him to listen and to be available for her at that point would be to say, okay, so you caught up with your friend. I hear that she wasn't listening. What are you feeling? Like, what emotions were you feeling from it? What are you feeling about it? And she'll say, I'm feeling quite unheard and frustrated. And then he says, okay, I understand that you're feeling frustrated and unheard from that interaction. It's perfectly valid for you to be feeling that. Then there can be solutions, because she feels like that he understands her feelings, and now there's that emotional connection. And then she's open to, I guess, going forward with a different, a different path. But before the feelings are addressed, it's like, I mean, you can't resolve anything, any conflict or anything, until the feelings are understood and validated first. So that would be the most important thing in listening, is to really getting to what the person's feeling and giving that empathy and understanding validation to that before jumping to solutions or, explaining. Another common one that people do is explaining themselves. They explain themselves when the person's just having a feeling. Someone will say, oh, I feel annoyed when you leave your shoes at the front door. Oh, no, I didn't mean to do that, blah, 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 explanation, defensiveness. It's like, well, no, the person's just feeling something. You don't have to defend yourself. So getting to the feelings first is the most important thing. And it's quite hard to do if you didn't see that in childhood. It's a little bit of a different approach, but it certainly is the most effective way to listen, is to get to the feelings and listen to the feelings first. Try and get the person to express their feelings, and then everything else after that can go from there.
The next question came to me because Brené Brown wrote a new book. It's called The Atlas of the Heart. And she was curious what makes people compassionate. And the first thing that makes people compassionate is boundaries. And that made me think of my codependency, because I always confused being nice with being kind in the past. And they're actually very different. So what's the difference, being nice versus being kind? And what's the importance of boundaries in relationships?
Okay, boundaries are essential. It's like the body with not having boundaries is like the body without skin. It's like such a dangerous existence to not have boundaries, because like if you're not solid with where you finish and where other people start, and also where your responsibilities are and to who they lie, then life can be very confusing and painful and tiring when there's no boundaries. So compassionate and boundaries is a very important thing, because someone that I guess has boundary issues from childhood, they tend to put that compassion onto other people, and they tend to lack a lot of self-compassion. So they have compassion, but it's at the expense of the self. They lose themselves with compassion. They're compassionate towards others, but they're not compassionate towards themselves. And so compassion and kindness, they both need boundaries. So kindness, for example, right? If you want to give, if you want to give a homeless person some coins or some charity, then, you can certainly do that. But if you just give him all of your savings and everything, then you don't have money for your rent or your mortgage, and you've given away everything you own, because you have to be able to restrict your kindness, and also you have to be able to restrict also compassion. You have to have for yourself first, so in order to be able to give to others. And I think that's what the child that grows up in an environment where they really feel like that they have to be like the caretaker and have to look after mom and dad, or they have to solve the family's problems, or they have to emotionally try and keep the household stable. This child can grow up into someone that is compassionate and kind to everyone else, but they don't have the boundaries to leave anything over for themselves. And that can be very tiring, and also lead to a lot of resentment in a relationship if you're not giving yourself that kindness and compassion first. Without the boundaries, it can be very tiring, and it can even be hurtful, over time to be in that state without those boundaries. The other thing with boundaries is obviously also someone that is toxic, right? They project their unpleasant feelings onto you. They're blaming, or they're making accusations about you, or they're painting negative intentions onto you. Without boundaries, a person will just absorb all of that projection, and that is severely dysregulating to the person's feelings, and can even disrupt their thought patterns, and really they can lose their sense of self quite significantly. And I've seen people over the years get so, I guess, worn down and confused and disconnected from just constant blame and projection and gaslighting and other toxic behaviors, that they just like collapse. They disconnect so much that they just collapse. They have health issues. So, personal boundaries also helps a person's mental health, emotions, and even physical health from people that are missing boundaries themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know that was a lot, but boundaries are super important.
No,
Yes.
I hear reading and seeing online videos from life coaches to psychologists to psychiatrists. I hear some common misconceptions, or some half-truths and I don't know, maybe it's new information and I'm not that well prepared, or not that I don't know, enlightened. But I keep hearing some terms. For instance, empath. Each time I hear it, it's in a spiritual setting. And I would like for you, as a specialist in this field, to talk to me about the difference of codependent and empath, because some use this term empath like confetti, and I think it actually refers to codependence. And the second misconception would be that between autism and NPD. I would like to hear your take on it, and other very well-known misconceptions that you hear on a daily basis in this field of personality disorders.
Yeah, so in terms of the NPD autism misconception, like, can you enlighten me in regards to what's the common misconception there with autism NPD? Because there's a lot of misconceptions with both of those. I just want to make sure I understand the
I heard people talking about the difference from growing up from genetics and environment of people who had some parent that was NPD and they became autistic or vice versa. But I also hear some people that say that one is a spectrum of the other. And I think it's a huge difference because autist people have actually empathy. And so what would be the difference between those two?
Yeah, so I understand. So according to my understanding, autism, if you look it up on what causes autism, it's very different from what causes NPD. So NPD, as we know now, is caused by an emotionally neglectful childhood, whether it's like making the child into a trophy child or a golden child, like basically spoiling the child, but emotionally neglecting them at the same time. Or it could be the opposite, even where the environment for the child is so unpleasant that there's nothing really worthwhile on the outside in their childhood environment. So they just escape the house by going inside, and they don't have anything to do with the outside world. That's their escape. So that's, some of the foundations of narcissistic personality disorder. Whereas autism is something that, if you look it up, it has a number of different causes, and they might, manifest the same, but there are some significant differences. As you said, like an autistic person can have empathy, whereas a narcissist cannot have empathy. That they don't even have the ability to have empathy. So there are some significant differences. And I think one of the main things that I see with the hundreds of cases that I see every year is when you have, say, a narcissistic parent, or even like dysfunctional parents, whether one of them's a narcissist and the other one's BPD, or whatever the combination is, and then the child gets diagnosed with autism, and then a person has to ask the obvious question. So is it actually autism, or is it childhood trauma? Because if you look at the symptoms of especially the early stages of autism and childhood trauma, they're more or less exactly the same. So interpersonal difficulties, emotional dysregulation, learning. So I said learning difficulties, stunted development, processing issues. Okay, so this can also happen with a child that grows up in an emotionally neglectful environment, or has trauma, or has some type of attachment trauma, or in a dysfunctional home, whether it's alcohol use in the home, or conflict in the home. I mean, the list of traumas is quite extensive, and this can also look like autism. So this is also something that happens that's very common, where you have a narcissistic parent and the child gets a diagnosis of autism, and then the narcissistic parent just uses that autism diagnosis as a bit of a scapegoat. Like, oh no, it has nothing to do with my parenting. They're autistic. It's not me. They're autistic. They were born with it, but there's nothing wrong with my parenting, because the narcissist is always looking for a full person to take the responsibility for their dysfunction. So that's something that happens that I see quite regularly, where a child will be diagnosed with autistic because it looks the same a lot of the times with, early BPD can look autistic. Mm-hmm. And obviously there might be a little bit more to that than just an autism label. With the right program and the right, therapies and counseling and the right type of work, maybe they could, basically heal and get to grow out of that one day, which is not always the case with autism. So that's something that I see that's quite regular, is the child will become the autistic scapegoat by the narcissistic parent or parents. And because it looks the same, on the surface, but it's not. And so that's a common thing that I see. And as far as empath and codependent, I mean, I'm not really one for labels, but, I think you probably could combine those two into the one, because I think an empath is like this is just my understanding of it, but I think codependent is the actual term. And I think being an empath is a person trying to just make light of it. It's like, oh, I'm not a codependent, I'm an empath. It's like a spiritual codependent, but really it's the same thing.
Yeah, but I think this is why I asked the question. I had the impression that they are the same, because being a codependent, you should also own this and understand that it's not something normal. It's also a maladaptive way of coping with relationships, because it's not. So they're actually the same.
Exactly. I agree. And it's basically the fundamental thing with the codependent and empath. It goes back to what you said before, Diana, is boundaries. Both the empath and the codependent have empathy, but without boundaries. So their empathy doesn't have boundaries, and that obviously gets them into, a little bit of trouble, especially in relationships, because when you're empathic towards someone and at the expense of the self, then that becomes a problem. And that's the more empathy a person has, the stronger their boundaries have to be. And the empath and the codependent obviously both have disintegrated boundaries a lot of the time. And I think an empath is just another word for a codependent, but just trying to make it out to be more kind of spiritual or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now talking about spirituality, I'm a firm believer in Christ, but ever since I started praying and attending church, I have a lot of amazing people that attend church. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, actually it really doesn't matter, so Judaic. But I also saw a pattern of people that are abusers in certain religious communities. How could we spot one? Because these are actually, I have friends that don't believe in God or have their doubts, or a couple of friends mostly actually are, very vocal against these sort of people. Perhaps they had experiences in childhood or otherwise with people that came from religious communities and were abusers. How can you spot them easily?
Yeah, well, it's not always easy to spot. Again, I think this goes back to the first point that I made in our discussion today, and that is that a person has to be able to spot, meaning that they have to have the vision to be able to spot dysfunction or like red flags. And if a person grew up in a home where there was dysfunction, or there was emotional neglect, or there was other abusive behaviors or toxic behaviors going on in the house, and the child was witnessing this, it might be hard to spot an abusive person in any setting, especially in a religious community. Religious communities, and it doesn't matter what religion, it also exists in Judaism. Unfortunately, it exists in all religions. And I happen to think that religious communities are a real haven for abusers for the following main reasons. The first reason is that the religion offers a real character and an outfit and a whole kind of personality just by walking through the door. Like you grow a beard, you put on a hat, you wear a jacket. That's it. You're righteous now. Like you've got a sense of righteousness because that's the image that you're portraying.
So the emotions we should see in an abuser would be like contempt, like shaming, like what would be the reactions? This is what
So the main thing that you're going to notice with an abuser in a religious community, doesn't matter which religion, if it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Seventh-day Adventist, whatever religion you're associated with, is exactly the same with all abusers. What you're going to notice is you're going to notice the beginnings of behaviors that don't match what the person is presenting themselves as.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the target of this abuse then starts to feel incredibly uncomfortable, because now it's like, okay, this person who is seen by many as a very respectable and righteous individual has just done something towards me that was a little bit creepy or inappropriate, or maybe aggressive. And I'm the only one that knows about it. And who am I going to talk to about it? It's a very uncomfortable feeling to be put in that position where you've seen someone's behavior and you're the only one that's seen it. You feel like that you're holding a secret that could be very damaging to yourself if you expose that, because no one's going to really believe you because they haven't seen what you've seen. And also, so that's the main thing that a person's going to notice, is that, wow, this person is doing something that doesn't really fit what they're meant to be doing. That's the first thing. And that's just where it starts. Obviously, it gets much worse as the abuse increases. and it's very uncomfortable for the individual to experience this. Yeah. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
I could talk about this topic for 2 hours.
I heard a term coined on the internet. It's called parallel parenting, and it relates to children that come from divorced parents, from which one is abusive. What would be your thoughts or advices on parallel parenting when dealing with someone who's abusive and you left the marriage, in terms of protecting the children?
Yeah, this is such a great question, and it's so important. And a lot of people, they unfortunately get this wrong, and they could have good intentions, but it could be harming the children if the following things are happening. So first of all, when it comes to parallel parenting, if one of the parents is abusive and they have dysfunction and they are doing all types of unhealthy behaviors, for example, using the children as pawns, manipulating, speaking negatively about the other parent, which is very harmful for a child, even after there's a divorce. Like if a parent says something negative to a child, or if the child can hear it about the other parent, the child thinks, well, okay, so if you're saying negative things about my other parent, that's 50% me. So I'm 50% bad because you're saying my mom or dad is 50% bad. So it's very damaging to the child. So now if you have a toxic ex or an abusive partner and you're trying to parallel parent, the best thing that a person can do is to, first of all, to heal themselves as much as possible and to become the best possible person that they can be for the children, so that the children can see, okay, this is dad and this is mom. Dad is a bit, I don't know about dad. I feel uncomfortable when I'm around him. But with mom, I feel safe, I feel heard, I feel listened to, I feel validated around mom. So it gives them a healthy option, like a safe house, to be able to see the difference between dysfunction and function. And the worst thing a person can do is to play into the conflict and the drama of the abusive person, and to just start with the, saying negative things back, I guess, arguing, fighting, trying to turn the kids against the other parents. This type of behavior, it only destroys the children over time. So I think if you can't parallel parent with a functional person, you just have to become the best possible person that you can be, and to, I guess, educate the children on trauma and personality disorders, and try and explain what the other toxic parents, I guess, might be going through without talking for them, like saying things to them, something like, dad has some unresolved emotional things that he hasn't processed yet, and it causes him to behave in a certain way. And I want you to understand that. And I want you to understand that it doesn't change who you are, and you can still love your father and separate this behavior, because this behavior is not acceptable. So try and turn it into education rather than a fight, and, really just teach the child what's going on to the best of the ability, and to be as available and pleasant and supportive as possible, so that the child has at least one healthy parent if the other parent is not able to parallel parent in a healthy way.
So basically heal yourself so you don't get defensive and you don't talk bad about the other person. Okay.
Yes. And to not get dragged into the conflict, into the fight. And toxic people have a very good ability to drag you in and to make you feel irritated and frustrated and angry. Like, how dare they say that to my kid? Like they're making up lies, especially when there's lies. It's can be very, I guess, provoking. And so being able to deal with those feelings, and to be able to reframe the whole situation, and to just be as emotionally stable and healthy as possible, and to not take it personally, and to really just understand trauma and abusive behaviors as best as possible. And sharing that with the children will be the most beneficial thing for the children, rather than, playing into that drama and that conflict, which it never works out well for the kids. The kids just get anxious and they end up with a terrible insecurities and a negative sense of self, and they feel like that, well, my family's messed up. How come my family's messed up? Like, I don't see other people's parents acting like this. And it becomes a very big identity nightmare for the child. But if the child has one healthy parent that understands trauma and doesn't speak negatively about the other person, even though they're behaving badly, that is a very powerful example for the child to follow. And it teaches them that a person can be abusive and have unresolved trauma, but it doesn't mean that I have to fight with them. I don't have to fight with them.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, Josh. I also want to thank Tziporah. You are truly an inspiration because, as I said, I discovered your channel while documenting narcissism, and the entire road that Tziporah took and you took together with her, I think it's amazing, especially the part of keeping the family united and having children. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come onto your channel.